Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fanfiction Tapes. I am your host for the day because Maya is, I think, being taken to Guam or something. Uh, so I am your host, Dylan, for today, and alongside I have my guest today.
Hi, that would be me. I am Helena on Discord, Edelweiss, pronouns she, her.
Coolio.
And as always, I am our producer, Ian, pronouns he, him.
And my pronouns are Dylan, just so we're all understanding. And our topic today is classical tragedy. Much like this podcast is going to be a tragedy today.
Womp womp.
Oh.
What ending are we going for here in terms of classical tragedy? I'm hoping for Macbeth.
Ooh. Yeah, out of the sort of plethora of a library that we have to choose from, I think Macbeth might be the most solid, less problematic.
As long as it's not an Oedipus.
Please no.
Step Oedipus, what are you doing? Okay, let's talk about this ye old tropes and genre. So, very old, Greek old. And you know how old the Greeks are? Pretty old. They're
They go
older.
way back.
Yeah, they're older than the Bible, so Christians. Yeah, things existed before Jesus. Take that.
Is that like the opposite of checkmate atheists?
Yeah, checkmate Christians. And other religions are also available. But yeah, how much Greek stuff have you guys read?
Oh gosh, too much. My basically the entire crux of my university degree was based around the original Greek plays and tragedies. And there was a healthy dose of simple classical history piled on top of that. So, I know too much. I had nobody to tell me to stop, so.
Oh, good. We picked a good guest for today's episode then. I haven't read much Greek tragedy myself directly, but one of my favorite podcasts is Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. And the host Liv frequently does episodes where she will read through Greek tragedies. And she has recently covered Oedipus and Antigone on her show within the last few months.
Good picks.
So, Dylan, I know you weren't here for last week's episode, but we did briefly cover over exactly what is tragedy on there, and it's slightly recapped in the script. You want to go over that?
I mean, sure. We would describe it as a cynical story with mostly a downer of an ending. And downer of endings they usually are.
Well, it's a bit more than that. Not every cynical story with a bad end is a tragedy. There's specific things about the protagonist, usually, that make it a tragedy.
I mean, is it always? I mean, it happens a lot, but there's always outliers, you know.
Well, I mean, definitions, typically, especially in the writing world, are extremely fluid. So, what sort of was the rigidity of what was considered a tragedy in classical times? While it hasn't really changed, it's broadened. So, You'll have stories that don't necessarily fit the entirety of what might be considered a classical tragedy, but there's enough of it in there that it could pass as one, definitely. But sort of the quality of the protagonist, or at least the character, the perspective character, it is typically that of a downfall that is self-imposed. So the typical quality of a tragedy is that you're following a character who has some sort of fatal flaw, and throughout the story you see that bring about their downfall, usually by their own hands. And that's really what makes it a tragedy, is that you're watching somebody who, in most cases, should probably know better, basically tear themselves apart on their own.
Pretty much.
Can you tell I was a theater major?
What? You? No.
Well, it's funny that you brought up both Antigone and Oedipus, because those were the first sort of classical Greek tragedies that I started with in my degree back in university, to kind of be baby's first tragedy, as it was, in that it's very, very clear sort of the layout and the structure of these characters and how they act and how the story progresses. And you can see very clearly where the mistakes are made for these characters, which makes them very accessible in terms of the classics. If you go back further, you tend to kind of lose people when you start to talk about like the Dionysia, which is where sort of Greek theater began, with these huge theatrical parades and tributes to Dionysus. You tend to get people's eyes glossing over a little bit.
Definitely. Look, I haven't consumed much stuff, mostly through school. That's the only place I got it. And what I got was mostly, I got a bit of Macbeth, did some Odyssey, but Odyssey is not really one of those classic tragedy ones. It's more of a, wow, what an adventure we've been on here.
It's an Odyssey, literally.
Yeah, who would have thunk it? But yeah, when you do think of them, usually it's some crazy dude just sort of spiraling. I think Macbeth is like the perfect example of that. It's just a dude spiraling. It's like, oh, met some witches, now I gotta kill a bunch of kids.
Anakin, is that you? What makes sort of the genre of tragedy, especially in both classical writings and in Shakespearean writing, is that the characters start out as decent people. Like, they're characters that you kind of start out wanting to root for. They're either in a place that's pretty sympathetic, or they're in a good place, like at the start of Macbeth. He's just finished this massive war, and he gets to go home, which is cool. He's got a loving wife. She's a little crazy, but don't worry about it. And it kind of takes you aback how quickly things fall apart. But it is that starting point that kind of gives you that framework for the rest of the tragedy itself. Because if you just started with a character who's a terrible person and nobody could sympathize with, then the progression of that tragedy would not work at all. And it even sort of, in the classical plays, if you read the entirety of Oedipus, which is, if I remember correctly, 3 different pieces of writing, you see where it starts and you see where it ends. And the interference of sort of forces that are greater than man is a big thing in especially the Greek classics. And that really sucks, because it's not something, it's not a fate that's brought about necessarily by the actions of the character or the actions of the character in trying to avoid this god-given fate actually end up playing into it, which is exactly what happens in Oedipus. But it's kind of that starting point, and then the inevitability of it that makes it to me so impactful.
Well said.
I told you guys weren't going to get me to shut up this time.
No, great. So, do you guys sort of enjoy these stories? Like, in general? Like, let me say, one of my favorite things is watching someone go through terrible things. Like, but then in the end, everything's happy. They won. So, how do you guys feel about, like, someone who starts out in a pretty good place and ends up tumbling? Like, how does that compare?
I mean, depending on how you characterize the person and what exactly their fatal flaw is, really changes how you feel about the ending. Right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. For me, it depends on if it's done well, and that can be entirely subjective. But there are times where the end of a tragedy, the moment of sort of release and realization and the conclusion hits really, really well. We have a couple examples on the list that are some of my modern favorites, but other times writers will get most of the way and then they'll screw something up and it just kind of falls flat on its face. So it does honestly entirely depend on the execution for me.
Does sort of what, like, do you turn on a character at some point, do you think? Like, you go from, this is a good person, but now they kind of need to go. They were good at one point. When you're thinking of, like, a Macbeth who starts out as a supposedly pretty good guy for, being a king. Debatable whether kings can be good in general.
Down with the monarchy.
It says the Welsh. But by the end of the narrative, we're kind of just like, this guy sucks. Yeah. Die. Like, is that something you guys appreciate? Is the turning of, like, a change of perception in a character and how their fate occurs?
For me, I suppose a hallmark of a good or even great tragedy is sort of the balance of seeing this character go too far at a point and wanting them to suffer consequences from that, but at the same time maintaining sympathy for them. Because tragedy, in my view, should never get to the point where you don't identify with the character you're following. Because at that point, you've kind of lost the plot, literally and figuratively. So, yes, but also no? Question mark?
I suppose it depends on how easily you fall into Schadenfreude. Because I guess if you do actually hit a point where you're no longer really identifying with the character, you're either just going to step away from the story or you're going to start actively rooting for their downfall.
Yeah. I mean, Helena, at the time of recording this, speaking of wanting to root for previously main characters' downfall, in a few days, the finale to Attack on Titan's the anime is coming out.
Yes, it
And you want
is.
to talk about, sort of that classic tragedy sort of stuff. Whoo boy.
Oh man, I know that opinions on Attack on Titan have been mixed for a while, if not since it first came out. But man, I will stand by that ending. I love it so much. It hurts so bad, and I love it. But yeah, the protagonist of Attack on Titan, Eren, not to give any manga spoilers because I have read the ending. But he is very much a pretty good example of a modern classic archetype of a tragic character. Because he's starting in a good place and through a fatal flaw kind of brings about their own destruction. Like, that is the character in a nutshell. And it's been fantastic to watch, and I cannot wait to see how Mappa does the ending.
Yeah. Well, so within these stories, though, what are your favorite tropes that show up often in these?
So I'm looking at the handful that I listed in the script, and of course, there's a lot more tropes than just those that commonly show up in tragic works. I particularly like the way that a character's fatal flaw in a tragedy wouldn't necessarily be a bad trait if it was a different genre.
Mm-hmm. Do you care to give an example?
I think Antigone might be a good example of this. So, if I recall correctly, it's kind of a sequel to Oedipus, right?
Yes. Oedipus is Antigone and Ismene's father.
Okay, so basically, after the end of Oedipus, two of Oedipus's sons are fighting over who's going to be king of Thebes since he stepped down. And there was a civil war, and both of them die in battle. And their uncle ends up as the ruler of the city. And he decrees that as punishment, neither of them is to be buried. And Antigone, her fatal flaw here is that she believes in her own moral compass, no matter what the law says.
Yeah, more or less. So Antigone is a character who can be best described as loyal to a stubborn fault. She believes that it is right and her duty as a sister to bury her brother, despite the danger and the consequence, which unfortunately ends up being her own death.
I'm remembering now when Liv covered this on Let's Talk About Myths. She mentioned some modern reinterpretations of Antigone that recontextualize it in different sorts of issues, adaptations, where, for example, instead of making it so that Creon has decreed that the brothers shall not be buried, and Antigone goes and does that anyway. There was I'm forgetting the name of the work, but it was a adaptation where Creon gets elected governor of someplace, Texas, I think, on an anti-abortion platform and then goes back on that. And Antigone in that adaptation is an anti-abortion crusader.
Ooh.
Pretty cringe.
Yeah.
No. Actually, I was going to say that's a pretty interesting interpretation. Not necessarily one that I agree with, but that is a fascinating way of looking at it.
I mean, the actor being anti-abortion, that's cringe.
But this idea of being so certain in your moral compass that you know what is right no matter what the law says, it really depends on, what your compass is pointing to, whether that's a fatal flaw or a heroic character trait.
Absolutely. And in response to Dylan's original question, I was also going to say fatal flaw, bread and butter. Every time I love seeing a trait that would otherwise be a good quality be turned into something that leads to a character's downfall. Like, it is so good.
Yeah. So, obviously, a lot of creators create tragedy. None more so than not my countrymen, because I'm not English, but the fellow guy from the same island as me, Bill Shakespeare.
Willie Shakes.
Yes. What do you guys think of his tragedies? Obviously, we've talked about some of them here. They are very of the time. The old 1600s, right? Slapped it and bang in your face.
I think to this day, Shakespeare has written not only some of my favorite tragedies, but just some of my favorite plays in general. They are always so fun, so open to interpretation and adaptation, including the tragedies. If you do them right, they are brilliant. So we've mentioned already probably my enduring favorite, which is Macbeth. But I'm also pretty partial to Hamlet. Yeah. But I am also pretty partial to Hamlet, and I have a soft spot for King Lear as well. I did that in my fourth year of studies, and I'd never read it before. But it's stuck with me for quite a while.
And why don't we talk about like the bane of like most high school and middle school students? Even though I didn't have to deal with it, but I think a lot of people do. Let's talk about the proverbial elephant in the room. What's Romeo and Juliet, and how does this fit in? Where does it fit in?
So, Romeo and Juliet's not really a tragedy in the same way as these other ones we've been talking about. It's tragic, but the bad ending is mostly bad luck.
It's a comedy of errors.
Yeah.
It's basically Tom and Jerry at the end there.
That's an apt comparison. She's dead. No, she's not. He's dead. Oh no.
I just think back to like the epic rap battles of history. Where's Romeo? Oh no, Meo.
Oh no.
It is ridiculous. And like the tragedy is like these two like young dumb teenagers are being kept apart by values of the time, like, oh, we don't like those people, you can't hang, they did this to
I am going to quote something I cannot for the life of me remember what channel it was, and I apologize profusely for that, but it is one of my favorite things, and I still quote it, like, monthly. You love him. You met him Sunday. It's barely Thursday morning. Slow down, crazy.
It's true.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, no, Romeo and Juliet, I suffered through that, and I do mean suffered, because why is it in every single curriculum? It's the one thing that every single student, English major, whoever I've met absolutely dreads reading. It's not necessarily bad, it's just a bit of a slog, especially when you know that you're going to have to read it. But it's a tragic comedy. It's a combination of the two genres, and it has some qualities from both, but it makes it weird in that sense. It's not completely one or the other.
Like, the story, like, what happens isn't comedic, but the way it happens is kind of. Like, it's not comedic that these two, like, star-crossed lovers died, but it's comedic in, like, the extent they were pushed to. And then they had this plan and completely fucked it up.
That's a pretty apt summary, yeah.
I suspect that it's in every high school English curriculum because it's about teenagers.
That's like the only reason I could really see for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like in my school, my drama teacher said like she like went to find like one of the adaptations and she got the one with like, I don't know if it was the full-blown sex scene in it.
Oh god.
Mm.
But a bunch of 14-year-old boys, you know, some, you know. Wild.
Oh man. No, I remember that as well. And I think maybe what turned me off of the play might have been the film adaptations, because they're just so unnecessarily raunchy in that sense.
Well,
and why would you ever want to show this to like 13-year-olds?
I mean, yeah, just watch Romeo and Juliet. Wild.
Speaking of film adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, the first one that comes to mind is, have you guys seen the 1996 one by Baz Luhrmann?
Is that
Yes.
the one where it's modern times?
Yes.
Yeah, that was the one she was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also stirred some controversy since then because the director pressured like the young actress who played Juliet to be, you know, be nude and sexy, and I believe that's something I read.
I have vague memories of it, and my impression of it is that it is weird.
I mean, yeah. Like, I haven't watched it, but I question how Romeo and Juliet even, like, works in modern context.
So, the thing about it is, it's modern only in terms of dress and setting. The dialogue is still Elizabethan.
Wow. Wild.
So you have scenes like where someone will say, "Draw your sword," and he pulls out a handgun, and it focuses on the gun, and it says "sword" on the side. Yeah.
Oh no, now I remember.
Hollow 90s, I am asking, what drugs are you on?
And where can I get some? Damn.
Oh.
Completely and utterly wild.
Talking about other Shakespeare, I did want to mention Othello.
Yes.
Which I think I actually did read in high school. For that one, I don't think I've ever read a play, a tragic play, any of other Shakespeare's works where I've wanted to grab the protagonist and shake him and go, "What are you doing, man?" Hamlet a little bit maybe towards the end, but Othello is more frustrating.
I think that that's also a hallmark of a pretty good tragedy, when you do desperately want to take the character by the shoulders and just shake them and be like, "You're being an idiot, stop. There's still time to turn it around, just stop."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it was nice for you to say that, but, I love democracy. But this is no longer one. Because I'm going to make us talk about modern stuff. And the first one I want to talk about is one... Well, fortunately, for once, I know 3 out of 4 of the things on this list. Wow, that's big for me. Usually my and Ian's one bit, and it's like, I can get 1 here, maybe.
There's one on here that it's unfortunate that Maya had to miss this for.
But let's talk about episode 3, Star Wars.
Star Wars prequels, yes.
My favorite of the Skywalker saga. All 9. That's my favorite.
He doesn't like sand, Dylan.
That's in the movie before, okay?
I mean,
that's Attack of the Clones.
Have you felt sand? It is coarse and rough and gets everywhere.
Helena, you're Canadian. You don't get sand. You get snow and snow.
Fair.
I live
Fair
in
play.
Hawaii. I have been to many beaches.
Mm.
I'm familiar with sand.
I live an hour from the coast. I've been to many beaches. But anyway, that was Attack of the Clones. We're about Revenge of the Sith. A much better movie.
Agreed.
And honestly, very good tragedy. Order 66 is nuts, and the character of Anakin Skywalker. Although a little dodgy-wodgy how we got here, at the end of the day, I think his arc really works.
It does, but when I saw this in the script, I wanted to point something out, because absolutely Anakin's story throughout the prequels is a tragedy, and that especially comes to a head in episode 3. However, it's the long-awaited setup to the conclusion of a tragedy that we got in episodes 4, 5, 6, especially the end of episode 6.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Episode 3 does a very, very good job at everything up to a point, and then you can pick that up over the course of the next 3 movies, and especially at the very end of Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, it like the end of episode 6, it's still a bit tragic, but it's triumphant as well at the same time. Whereas, episode 3, not very triumphant. We're just glad a couple of you guys survived. Jeez.
Yeah.
I really think that, because we're not only looking at it from Anakin's perspective, but also how, Jedi get completely wiped out. The failures of the Jedi Council, how the Republic was so easily transformed. Like, this is how democracy ends.
With thunderous applause.
That's like one of the things that I think the prequels will always have over the sequel trilogy is just, it's a perfect, if you remove George Lucas's like weird decisions and bad dialogue, it's a very good story.
The bones are there.
Yeah.
He just needed an editor who could tell him no.
Yeah. Like, meanwhile, the sequels are what I describe as, like it's there's no bones. It's like it's Play-Doh being pushed out of a tube. And it's not a good shape either.
Well, I think with episode 3, you definitely can see where George Lucas did his homework in the sense of the tragedy that he wanted to shape, because it is that very, very firm classic hero versus fate kind of notion, and you get that as far back as episode 1 with this big prophecy of the Chosen One and this impossible pressure that Anakin's put under from the moment he's brought into the Order, and it is sort of a higher power imposing things on our protagonist until the point that he makes all of these mistakes.
I also find it interesting that, at the end of the day, the prequels are like, they're Anakin's story and Palpatine. And then you just have like Obi-Wan. He's there. He's just a guy. But it's weird how to position that character then, isn't it? But he's just got to be the guy who stops Anakin for the time, And it's tragic for him too. That was his brother. He loved him.
This is just an excuse for you to use all of the prequel memes.
It's very quotable, which makes it good. Speaking of, let's move on to something else that can get memed. Let's talk about Infinity War. Now, despite Marvel completely sucking ass now, Infinity War is the peak, I'd say. And it's very good. You guys, Infinity War fans?
I want to say it's the first where we had a really big loss, but I guess some of the Captain America movies did have somewhat downer endings. Winter Soldier in particular.
I mean,
or not Winter Soldier, Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
I'm saying Winter Soldier, and I'm picturing the Captain America versus Iron Man fight, and that was Civil War.
Yeah. But, Infinity War, incredibly downer ending, and, like Thanos says, it was inevitable, though. And it's sort of the underrated thing about the build-up to Infinity War is that all of, the major Phase 2 and Phase 3 crossover stuff was built for that. Trying to make Ultron, Civil War, splits everyone apart. So it's like we're watching a tragedy across multiple films, and then when we get there, oh boy, that ending is rough.
You should have gone for the head.
But ultimately, as it is a Marvel thing, it gets repaid what was it? 3 movies later, we get an Ant-Man movie, a Captain Marvel, and then everything's back to normal. We just lose a few bodies.
That was sort of, I don't want to say that it's where I fell off the MCU wagon, but it's kind of where I started being over it, was Endgame.
Yeah,
they gave themselves an impossible task in trying to conclude what they set up with Infinity War. Like, they set themselves up for failure. That's the real tragedy here. But
and then they kept on going even after that.
Oh gosh, we all know the modern state of Disney. If it makes money, quality doesn't matter. But honestly, I will be the controversial one and say that I think Infinity War is extremely tragic, but I'm not entirely sure that I would personally slot it into the category of a tragedy.
It's not necessarily. It's just like a villain wins movie. Like, ultimately, like, a tragedy is something more like Civil War, I'd say. Even though they aren't huge, as big a loss as Infinity War. I think that's more of a tragedy. You know, like the breakdown in relationship between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark.
Yeah, that I could say
yeah.
is a bit closer. Again, though, I don't want to say that tragedy as a genre is like this super, super rigid thing. It can sort of flow and conform and appear in ways that you wouldn't really expect. So definitely I could see it, but also my own sort of biases lean me away from labeling it as one.
And who boy, talking about the third tragedy we have here, Arcane. This is tragic as
Woo!
hell.
Oh boy. Arcane. They could have subtitled this as Arcane, the tragedy of Jinx.
Oh, yes. My god. My poor, poor girl.
Just from everything. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Whether we look at individual character stories and how tragic they are, like if we look at Victor, if we look at Vi, if we look at Jace, Mel, oh god.
Everybody here is in their own tragedy, and we just happen to be watching them interweave. And it's so great.
Yeah, it's like when the best thing is us going, well, at least Echo and Heimerdinger are hanging out.
They're just chilling down there.
Yeah,
please leave them alone.
Yeah, like we just go, that's the best ending anyone has got in the show. Like, ooh boy.
I think it's super interesting to sort of break Arcane apart into its various character stories. And as we very explicitly just said, I think Jinx is probably the clearest cut in terms of just massive tragic character. Like, this poor girl's fatal flaw is that she just wants so badly to help.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it hurts so bad.
Yeah, going. And it really is weird in a sense that Jinx is, for all intents and purposes, like, I want to say, like, the main character as well. And so she does fit perfectly into, you know, that tragic main character trope. Like, despite a lot more people getting screen time and stuff, like, Jinx is the one who moves the plot forward the most. My girl is zooming. What's your favorite Arcane tragedy?
Oh boy. I would say honestly it would be Jinx, but I'm not sure whether it would be the moment where her gadgets actually work for the first time and its horrible consequences.
Yeah.
Or whether it's the scene with the final confrontation between her and Vi and Kate and Silco, and she just flies off the handle and lets off a burst and kills her dad for the second time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, but just looking at the characters, you know. And that ending, want to talk about tragic. Wow. They had voted for it. The council had agreed.
And speaking of that ending, that that ending is a really great example of a trope we're going to be talking about in a couple weeks of dramatic irony. Probably one of my favorite tropes.
Yeah, it's like if Jinx doesn't do this, things get a lot better pretty quickly. You know?
Uh-huh.
But
Jinx doesn't know that the council has just voted. Admittedly, she probably wouldn't necessarily care. Oh.
Yeah. By that point, Jinx is dissociated.
My favorite part about the ending is just what she tells Vi at the end about how she thought that her older sister could love the person she's become, and just how jaded she is to realize that that's not gonna happen because they've just grown into completely different people. And it's that moment of catharsis of Jinx kind of acknowledging, I'm the bad guy, I know that, but screw everyone else. I don't owe anyone anything.
God, that entire last scene.
Oh, it is so good.
From, are we still sisters? Like, from there on, it's peak. Oh, it's so good.
I'm so excited for season 2.
More tragedy.
Oh yeah. I'm ready to have my heart ripped right out.
It's like funny that like there are not many things that I can go like, I love this, and like the ending makes me sad. Because what I'm normally attracted to is like I from episode 1 to like whatever, I want pain, and then 25 I want happiness. Whereas with Arcade, it's like I'm just in like a constant like 3 episode cycle of pain. we you know, I'm happy, I'm concerned, and then I'm pain. I'm happy, concerned, and pain. That's just kind of the cycle of that show. So I think, you know, I'll ask, you know, we've talked about the ones that I can talk about. How about we bring our individual ones? I want to talk about a little tragedy that we like. Why don't we start with Miss Guess Helena? Helena, is there any tragedy you want to talk about? Any show, book, play? Anything at all?
Oh gosh. I think we've pretty much covered all of my favorites. There was a... When I was growing up, I had some pretty strange, like, reading interests, and I read a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. And that probably remains one of my favorite sort of modern tragic pieces of literature. There's just so much that goes wrong, so much that happens to the point where it's almost on the verge of a literary version of like a tragicomedy versus a play version. Yeah, I haven't picked it up in so long, and I need to go back and read it again.
I don't think I've read to the end of that series, but that was another that I also followed those books for a while.
Ian, what about you? Is there any piece that you are thinking of?
Is there anything that we haven't mentioned today so far? Actually, it's either the third or the fourth Honor Harrington novel that is... It's not a full tragedy in the sense that the hero dies at the end. it very easily could have been. However, the ending of the novel does end with Honor politically disgraced and exiled from her home kingdom. It is also probably one of the best books in the early part of the series. And at the very least, it does have an absolute worm of a character get his comeuppance.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. But yeah, I think otherwise, all of the any other tragedies that I really wanted to talk about, I already put in the script.
Mm-hmm. For me, there's a Xenoblade for everything. And for me, it would be the Xenoblade 2 prequel DLC, Torna the Golden Country. Holy crap. You want to talk about tragedy? Oh boy. So the story follows the main bad guy of main game 2 before he was a bad guy. And you know, let's just say good characters inadvertently destroy continents. Terrible things happen. Children die. Named children characters. Whew. It's very, very bad. And the ending, we see the ending in the main game. We don't get to see that ending, which is the main character of the DLC, Jin, who is a blade, which is a type of being that is awoken by a human and connects with them. And when the human dies, they return to a crystal form, and when they are reawoken by another human, they memories are completely wiped from their previous life. So Jin, in order to not forget his driver, Laura, eats her heart so that he does not forget, return to his core crystal and forget her. And he is now basically immortal, unable to die. And the final monologue he gives, holy crap. We have to put like the ending of it in the credits for people to understand how tragic it is. And I'll show you guys after the show, because oh my god. Like, each Xenoblade game makes me cry at the end for different reasons. Torna is, well, I feel so sorry for everyone here. Ian, so no new mail within the mailbag this week?
No new mail today. We love to hear from our listeners. So if you want to reach out and have a shoulder to cry on about any tragedies you've read recently, you can send us an email at fanfictapes@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on our YouTube channel or leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We also continue to have a social media presence on Twitter, formerly X. Maya normally runs that. And she mostly posts about our new episodes, but occasionally posts some behind-the-scenes stuff and shit posts.
Alrighty. Sounds good. Helena, anything you want to promote? Get that plug in while you're here.
Nothing in particular.
Are you sure? Are there any fan works that you maybe are involved in?
Oh my god, too many. It would take forever for me to list them. You know that. You know that. Oh, goodness gracious. No, I'm not even going to try. No.
Where can people find you and maybe perhaps find out about all these fan works you work on?
Okay, fine. I yell about stuff usually on Twitter, which I have stayed on for some bizarre reason. Don't ask me why. But I also frequent Tumblr, and I can be found here on Discord. If you ever want to chat, drop me a line. I'm not that closed off of a person, to my own detriment sometimes.
It's true.
And also, just in general, go watch things. Go watch plays. Go watch TV shows. Go watch movies. Watch good ones. Watch bad ones so that you know what the good ones are. And enjoy. There's so much out there. Tragedy is a great genre, but it's one of many, and you are bound to find something out there in the visual and literary media world that you enjoy.
Awesome. Cool. We'll be sure to put some links to your handles in the description so people can actually find you. And yell at you.
Sounds good.
Anyway,
Please come yell at me.
Yes, we will. I mean, we're always yelling at you, but now we can get others to do it for us too.
Usually just to go to bed, but
Sleep. So I have been Dylan, and with me today we've had our guest,
Helena / Edelweiss / whatever I happen to go by.
Missed too many names, okay. And
I have been Ian. Until next time, bye.